Some of the most incredible scenes we encounter as photographers are during harsh weather like this sandstorm, but that doesn't mean our raw files will automatically convey the beauty of the moment. So in this video, you'll learn some great tricks for adding dynamic light in post to truly reveal the excitement of a scene like this. I've opened my raw image in Photoshop, and as you can see, overall, it's really pretty flat and lifeless straight out of camera. That's due to several factors. There's a lack of contrast between the highlights and the shadows, with the shadows being especially too light. There's an overall cool cast that doesn't feel like a sunset. And then the wind, even though the wind is blowing at 40 miles an hour, it's kicking up all the sand and dust. It was ferocious. I had sand stuck on my ear. You hardly see it in the scene. I mean, this moving sand is very little different from the foreground ridges here of the static sand, or this cloud of dust. It's obscuring these distant mountains, but you hardly notice it. So what I want to do here is process a sense of strong sunlight off the left, kicking across the scene to really increase the drama and address all of these problems all at once. So to get that started, I'm going to double click on my raw smart object, go up to the basics tab, and begin the processing by warming it up to get rid of that cool cast. So to bring up the temperature to about 8,000, let's warm up the tint to match to around 5 or so. And then to bring out more color in the sky and make sure the shadows are dark enough, let's really pull down on the exposure all the way down to like maybe -1.25. I know that looks pretty dark. We're going to push the blacks even further because I really want some dark shadows in this area. I go into the reasons for this sort of processing more in my master courses, but this is a pretty good base to work from. And now I can push up more luminosity and color in this yellow sand by going down to the camera calibration tab, grabbing the blue saturation slider and pushing up on that to something like +90. And now take a look from where we started to where we are, where you're starting to feel a little bit of the motion of the wind in the foreground. You're really starting to see that dust cloud separated from the rest of the sky and the distant horizon there, or the contrast from this cloud to the deep shadows. Everything's starting to look a bit better. It's not there, but it's a good base to work from. And my next step is going to be to add sunlight as a local change. So I'm going to want to do that on a separate layer. So let's go ahead and click OK, make that the base of our image. And now I want to duplicate it and process it differently for the sunlight. Now to do that, I can either right click and choose New Smart Object via Copy, or just shift click on the raw button in the basics panel, or same thing on the pre-blend, I can shift click that. But it's creating this independent copy, meaning that as I change the settings on this raw smart object, I won't change the layer below it. So I'm going to rename this as sun. This will be my sunlight. And we're going to process this to look like sunlight, and then we'll add a layer mask to reveal it in just a moment. So let's double click it. And to process the sunlight, let's go back up to the basics tab, and it should be a lot warmer. Let's push it up to like 20,000. Let's push up the tint to something around like 15. It should be brighter, so let's just reset the exposure back to the default neutral position. I think this cloud is getting a little bit bright. Let's bring down the highlights, make sure that's not going too far. And then these shadows have gotten way too bright. So let's bring down our blacks to something like -50, make sure we're maintaining some separation there. Now, I'd still like to have more sense of sunlight on the dunes here, because I'm going to blend in light from the left and start to kiss these sand dunes. So this, to me, needs a little bit more life. I'm going to go down to the curve, and let's push up our light slider to something like +50. I'm going to have to be careful about how I blend in the sky. I don't want to blend in that bright, but that is generally speaking the direction that I want to take things. I think that looks pretty good. So let's say OK. And then what I need is a black layer mask to conceal it, and then we'll start to blend it back in. So I'm going to Alt-Option click on Mask in Lemenzia, or same thing down at the Layers panel, which is hiding everything. And now what I need is a layer mask which is really bright over here to reveal the strong sunlight, and then tapers off to nothing as we get further out, so it's just sort of fading. And that's a great job for the radial gradient tool. So let's hit G for the gradient. Let's go make sure it's on a black to white transition using the radial setting. And then we just click and drag from the starting point of the light to the end point, something like this. And while that's not bad, I really don't want a perfect sphere here. Everything's symmetrical. It's not angled down like sun would be. It's too bright in the lower left-hand side here. I really want more of like an angled oval coming down and right. So I can take my sphere and we can transform it. So I'm going to hit Command T or go up to Edit, Free Transform. Shortcut is Command T. And now we can shrink it so that it's more of a horizontal oval. Now, notice that the pixels got kind of wonky there. And the reason is that I didn't unlock the layer mask. So as I'm resizing the layer mask, it's also resizing the layer. So I should have turned off that little link icon before I changed it. But there's another problem here I want to show. So I'm going to go ahead and accept this. And let's just Alt-Option click on the mask and notice that it's clipped. What I really want is for things to get dimmer. I want shades of gray going up here, not immediately going to black. And I don't want to go immediately black here. I want shades of gray fading down. So what happened was when I created the gradient, anything that hit the edge of the mask got clipped, and it just assumes black outside of that area. It doesn't know that there's any gradient outside of there. Unlike regular pixels, the mask doesn't seem to exist or doesn't let you paint outside the canvas. But there's a workaround we can use for that. So we'll take a look at a different approach. Let's go step back and try again. So I'm going to hit Command Z a couple times. So we're back to our black mask. And let's try a different approach. I'm going to turn off the link by clicking on it. So now I'll be able to resize this without affecting the pixels, because of course I don't want to stretch those pixels. So now we're going to create another gradient, but this time I don't want to let it go off the edge of the image, because if I do, it will be clipped. Instead, I'm going to click and drag from kind of the center of the image towards the edge and create a sphere that I can then stretch any way I want without being clipped. And I did actually clip this. See, I didn't get it perfectly in the center. I went too far. So let's undo that, and I'll show you how to do this more perfectly. If I hit Command Z to undo, this time I'm going to hit Command R for the rulers. And if you don't see percentages, you can right click and choose percent. With percent, what we're looking for is as you move the cursor, see that little tick mark that's moving? When it's on 50, I'm centered horizontally. And when it's on 50 over here, I'm centered vertically. And when I have both, I'm in the dead center of my image. So I can go right here, click, drag down, not all the way to the edge, but just kind of close, because I might not be perfect in the center. But now I've got a sphere that isn't clipped because it didn't go all the way to the edges. So now if I hit Command or Control T, notice the little blue bounding box never hits the edges. So I'm perfectly inside of things. And now I can do whatever I want to change this without clipping, because the whole thing exists. So let me escape out of that for a second. Let's just Alt-Option click so we can see the image and what we're doing. So we've created this sphere in the middle, and that doesn't look very interesting yet. We need to position this correctly. So I Command or Control T so I can resize it. And what I'm looking to do is move it so that the center is above the horizon and the light's kind of coming down and to the right in a thin beam. So the first thing I need to do is move the center over there. And these markers here are showing me the horizontal center and the vertical center. So if I slide over to the edge, now I'm horizontally centered on the edge, and I can move up like so, where this is above the horizon. So now I've got the sunlight emanating from just above the horizon here. So that's properly centered. And now I need to stretch this out. So I can click and drag from the edge. But as I do that, notice that the center point moved to the right as well, which I didn't want. I wanted to leave it there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to undo that with Command Z and redo it. But this time I'm going to hold down Alt or Option before I click. And now as I drag, I'm resizing around the center. So you can't see it, but the left-hand side of this box is moving further to the left off the screen. And so in doing so, I kept the center right where it was. And I can just hold down Alt or Option and move this until I get the exact length of the beam I want without screwing with the centering on this thing. And I can stretch the height of it any way I want by, again, holding Alt or Option. See, both sides are moving there. And I can move outside the box where I get this little bent arrow. And if I click and drag, I can angle it. So I can do something like this. And now to just really get it perfect, I can Alt or Option click, drag it out till I feel like the sunlight's penetrating as deep as it should be on the sand and as wide as it should be. Something like that, to me, feels like a pretty good sense of some bright sunlight coming across the scene. It's not the complete picture. I'm going to brush in more stuff on this foreground sand, but overall, it's a pretty nice glow. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the check mark to accept that. And you can see now by Alt or Option click, we've got this angled sphere here. And the cool thing about it is, while you cannot paint outside the mask, you can still move it off the mask. If I hit Command or Control T now, see my bounding box is showing there's content out here. If I move it around, I actually still have that whole oval. So I can keep resizing it and do whatever I want to it. As long as I originally created it inside the mask, I'm okay. Now I'm going to escape to cancel out of that because I already had a good approach, but I just wanted to show that you can non-destructively keep changing this thing as long as you just create that initial radial gradient inside the mask. That's the key. So now with this, I want to add more light on the sand, and this is a pretty warm light. I'd like to process this a little bit differently, and I don't want to do it on my gradient because if I ever have to change the gradient and I paint in these areas, then I won't be able to stretch it anymore once it becomes specific to parts of the sand. So let's create another copy by shift-clicking on raw, or again, right-clicking and choosing that new smart object via copy. This time, let's rename it as sand. And the sand is going to be processed a bit differently. So let's double-click it. And I think that the lights here could come up further. Let's make it really bright because these foreground areas are a little bit dark. And then it's too warm, it's too yellow. So let's go up to the warmth here on the temperature and drop that back to, like 12,000. Feels more like kind of a lit sand color to me. So we'll say okay. And of course, we've got the same gradient that we inherited. So I'm going to go and just make this a black mask by trashing that, and then just Alt-Option click on mask to start with a black hidden mask for this area. Make sure it's unlinked so we can do any stretching, although I'm not going to do any stretching here because we're going to use a luminosity selection, so I wouldn't do that. But if you're going to do the gradient, you want to unlock it. So to paint in these areas here, what I want to do is paint on the highlights of the sand, but not the deep shadows. So I want to light this area of sand, but not so much this area of sand. Or I want to light this area of sand, but less so these darker areas here. That's a great case for a luminosity selection. So I'm going to go up to Lumenzia, and what I want to do is pick the brighter midtones. And this row of A through E here, these are the wide zones, and zone C is the dead center midtone. That's a pretty good place to start for something like this. And you can see where things are lit brighter, they're going to be more selected. I can paint more in those areas. I can reveal more of this secondary light here. Now, I do want to paint down in these ridges further below. So this is too dark here. Anything that's black is protected and unpaintable. So I want to extend the mask further down into the scene, and I'm going to revise it by using the precision slider. If I just drag it up, something like, 25 is too much. Let's go to like 15 here. You see how now there's these ridges that the shadow areas are dark, they're protected, but I can paint in the lighter areas. That is a good preview for what I want to do, where it's grabbing the highlights of this area, and I'm able to paint on the sand, as well as maybe a little bit more in the sky if I want to add a little bit more secondary light in the sky. So I'm going to go click on cell to turn that into an active selection. I've got my mask selected, and all I have to do now is paint with a white brush. I'm going to hit B for my brush. I've got a large brush at high opacity and low flow, and now I can just brush over these areas here to reveal that light. And some of these areas down below that weren't as strongly selected, I may have to brush on them a couple times to enhance them. But I'm just trying to enhance that sense of sun coming across the scene here, and maybe even add some to the sky here, kind of rake through. And if I overdo it, like that was probably a little too much, I can grab the fade slider in the basics panel and just bring it back, or just go up to edit fade in Photoshop there would bring that back. So if you ever paint a little too much, you just fade back to get the amount you want in those areas. It's a nice little trick to really target things here. So with that, feel like that is adding some nice dynamic light to my scene. That looks pretty good. Now with that, the last thing I want to do is maybe bring down the corners even a little bit more and make it even more directional. So I'm going to hit L for a lasso selection and just kind of bring it around the edges, something like this. I'm going to target this for a vignette. So with that selected, go click on vignette in Lumenzia. I'm going to go ahead and accept the default feather, and you see how it darkens those edges. Maybe I'll increase that feather by just dragging this slider up a little bit, just soften it up ever so much more, and maybe bring the opacity of that down a little bit so I don't darken as much here, maybe like 15 or so percent. Just kind of darkens those areas a little bit, brings your eyes back where I want them. But just look overall now. If we go click on the before button to where we started, where it's lifeless, there's no sense of direction, you don't see the sand moving, you don't see the clouds, there's a lack of contrast that doesn't feel like a sunset sandstorm, to after, where clearly you have that kind of a dynamic and just a much more engaging photo that really shows the ferocity of the sunset sandstorm. Now click into this next video to learn more about how you can use luminosity masks to enhance your images.